In the deepest corners of a forgotten village. Some objects are never meant to be seen, especially not for too long. Never stare too long at this doll, is a haunting, terrifying, and mysterious horror story about a cursed doll that feeds on human souls. A dark secret buried in an abandoned house. And a chilling warning that could cost you your life. If you love psychological horror, ghost stories, supernatural legends, and deeply disturbing tales that linger in your mind long after midnight, this is a story you should never ignore. People often say that the most terrifying warnings in life are never written down on paper. Never framed and hung in the middle of a house. And never told clearly from beginning to end. They are only passed from one person's mouth to another's ear in a low, broken voice, as if speaking any louder would let the thing being mentioned hear. In Dong Mu hamlet, hidden deep among low hills and an old forest forever soaked in mist, there was such a warning. The people in the hamlet never said the name of that object outright in broad daylight. They would only tilt their heads, lower their eyes, and tell each other one sentence: "Never stare too long at this doll." I first heard that sentence at the end of July, when I had just moved to Dongmu to deal with my aunt's old house. My aunt died suddenly after a stroke in the city, leaving behind the ancestral house in the countryside, abandoned for nearly 10 years. My name is Nam, 32 years old, a freelance photographer, and I have never believed in ghosts, curses, or the things old villagers like to use to frighten the young. I came to Dongmu because I needed to sell the house, divide the inheritance, and also find a quiet stretch of time away from the city. When I got off the bus, the sky was overcast, the clouds piled thick like a layer of gray ash covering the whole region of hills. The wind blowing from the forest carried the smell of rotten leaves and cold moisture. Even though it was still summer, my aunt's house stood near the end of the hamlet, separated from the cluster of homes by an open patch of land overgrown with kogon grass and wild vines. It was the kind of old wooden house roofed with yin-yang tiles, low and long, with a brick courtyard, a well, a banana garden behind it, and a side wing connected to the main house by a dark corridor. From the moment I stepped through the wooden gate hanging crooked on one side, I had the feeling that the house was not merely abandoned, but was still holding on to something that time had refused to rot away. The smell inside was not exactly the usual smell of damp mold. It was more like the smell of an old cloth soaked in well water for too long, mixed with the smell of extinguished incense and a faint acrid scent, like burned hair, that drifted by and then disappeared. I opened all the doors to let the light in, did some basic cleaning in the front room, then went over to Old Bay's house next door to ask for hot water. Old Bay was a man in his 60s, stooped-backed, with clouded eyes and skin yellow like old wax. When he heard my name and that I was Aunt Han's nephew, he looked at me for a long time, as though weighing something, then slowly said, "If you stay in that house for a few days, remember this. If you hear anything in the side wing, don't run in there, and if you see the doll, cover it with a cloth. Don't look at it for too long." I laughed, thinking he was joking, and asked him what doll he meant. Old Bay, who had been pouring water, suddenly froze. The hot water overflowed the mouth of the thermos and spilled onto the cement floor. But he did not notice. Only after several seconds did he look up and say, "Your aunt didn't tell you?" I said no. He stared out into the yard, where the bamboo branches brushed against one another with a rustling sound like whispering voices. Then only shook his head. "Better not to tell. The less you know, the longer you live." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon, but not enough to truly trouble me. I cleaned until late at night and managed to finish only 2 rooms. Exhausted, when I took a flashlight and walked down the corridor through the side wing to look for a broom, I saw that the last door on the left was locked from the outside with a thin rusted chain. A stream of cold air seeped out from beneath the crack of the door, so unnaturally cold that the skin on my wrist prickled. I crouched down and shone the light through the gap, but inside there was only a dense darkness, as if the room were far smaller than the space it should have occupied. From inside came a very faint sound, like fingernails tapping on wood from somewhere very deep within. Knock, knock, knock. 3 even taps. I stood there listening for a few more seconds, and then the sound stopped, thinking it was a rat or some piece of tile shifting in the night chill. I turned away, but just as I had taken 2 steps, I heard behind me a soft dragging sound, as though something were being pulled across the floor on the other side of the door. The feeling then was not exactly fear, but the sense that someone was standing close behind the back of my neck. Not breathing, not touching me, just patiently waiting for me to turn around. I did not turn around. On my first night in Dongmu, I slept fitfully. The insects outside in the garden droned thickly, but around midnight they would all suddenly go silent for several minutes at a time, exposing stretches of silence so deep they felt suffocating. In one of those silences, I woke because I heard the sound of a child's footsteps running along the corridor. Bare feet, small and quick, pattering on the old wooden floor. The steps ran from one end to the other, then stopped right outside my room. The door did not open, but I could hear clearly that something was standing outside. It did not scratch, knock, or call out. It just stood there. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the thin line of light beneath the door. A narrow, short black shadow blocked the moonlight outside. It stood there for a long time, so long that my legs went numb and I still did not dare move. Then the shadow shifted to one side, dragging with it that soft rustling sound, like old fabric rubbing along the floor. After that, the small footsteps faded away. The next morning I opened the door to check. The corridor was covered with a thin layer of dust, and on it were printed tiny footprints. Not the tracks of a cat or dog. Human footprints, the size of those of a child of 5 or 6. But something about them was terribly wrong. The toes were unnaturally long, and they sank deep into the dust, as though whatever had made them weighed far more than its size should allow. The tracks led from the side wing to my room and then turned back. I used my phone to photograph them, intending to ask Old Bay later whether some village children had come in to play around. But when I opened the photo to look at it, I saw something that chilled me even more than those footprints. At the end of the corridor, right where the light failed, there was a faint face peering out from behind a half-open door. It was too small to belong to an adult, but the eyes were black and round in that lifeless way only objects have. I zoomed in on the photo. The image broke into grainy blur, but I could still make out one pale bluish cheek, a mess of tangled hair, and a fixed, unblinking stare. I whirled around to look toward the end of the corridor. There was nothing there. At noon I went over to Old Bay's house again. This time he did not avoid the subject. Perhaps he saw how pale I had become. We sat in his smoke-darkened kitchen amid the smell of strong tea and damp firewood. He asked if I had opened the last room in the corridor. I said not yet. He let out a long breath and slowly told me that more than 20 years earlier, Aunt Han's house had once held a little girl named an adopted child. No one knew clearly where she had come from. All they knew was that one night during a great flood, Aunt Han was returning from the district market and saw a little girl standing beneath the banyan tree at the head of the village, soaked through, clutching a worn cloth and porcelain doll. No matter how she was questioned, the child would not say her parents' names. Only one sentence: "Don't let anyone stare at it for too long." Aunt Han pitied her and brought her home to raise. From that day on, strange things began happening in the house. Chickens dropped dead for no reason. The well water, once clear, suddenly smelled fishy. Children passing by the courtyard would burst into terrified tears, pointing at the window and saying there was a little girl standing inside looking out. Aunt Han's adopted daughter hardly spoke. All day she only sat at the doorstep or the front porch holding the doll, as though guarding it. Once, some children in the hamlet teased her and snatched the doll away, running off with it. By evening, one of them was found hanging from the longan tree behind his own house, his tongue black and protruding, his eyes bulging open. The other two burned with fever for half a month, and when they woke, they clawed at their own faces and screamed that those eyes were still watching. I asked Old Bay why nobody had thrown the doll away. He gave a dry smile. The smile of someone who had lived too long beside something so horrifying that it no longer surprised him. He said people had tried. One village chief had thrown it into the river. The next morning, the doll was lying on the mat inside his house, soaked through, its hair plastered to its face, and the floor was streaked with watermarks dragged all the way from the front door to his bed. A ritual master tried to burn it. The moment the flames caught, the man's youngest son at home began convulsing, vomiting long black hair mixed with ash. Only when they put the fire out did the boy stop. And the strangest thing was that the doll only blackened slightly on one cheek, while most of its face remained deathly white, as if the fire had never touched it. "And the girl?" I asked. Old Bay was silent for a long time before answering. "She disappeared. One morning they woke up and she was gone. Only the doll was sitting in the middle of the house, its eyes turned toward the door as if waiting for someone to come in and take her place." From then on, Aunt Han locked the last room in the corridor and moved to the city. But she never sold the house, nor let anyone stay there. Each year she would secretly return once or twice, bring incense and candles and a new set of children's clothes, place them in that room, and leave before nightfall. I listened, horrified and irritated at the same time. In my mind I still held on to the explanations of a photographer, to angles, and the deceptions of light. I thought perhaps all of it was only a chain of random events embroidered with fear. But when I returned home, I saw that in the middle of the yard there was a small wooden stool that had not been there before. On it sat a doll. It was about the length of an adult forearm, with a body made of old cloth turned gray with age. dressed in a dusty silver lace gown. Its face was porcelain, white with a bluish tint, cracked with a thin line running from the corner of its left eye down to its jaw. Its hair was long, black, and tangled, but not dirty in the way things left outdoors for a long time become dirty. And the eyes. I will never forget those eyes. They were made of very dark glass. But they did not reflect light the way ordinary toys do. They absorbed light. Looking into them felt like standing before a deep dry well. The deeper you leaned in, the more it seemed that below was not darkness, but an opening void. The doll sat very neatly, its tiny hands resting on its knees. Its mouth was slightly open, just enough to reveal a black slit like a fine cut. I knew exactly what Old Bay had warned me about, but I still could not resist. As a photographer, I have a foolish instinct to move closer to anything strange. I knelt down to its level and lifted my camera. The lens struggled to focus, wavering as if unable to determine the subject. I changed angles, lowered the camera. This time the image came up clearly. But in the frame, the doll's eyes did not reflect my face or the yard behind me. They reflected a dark room. And at the far end of that room stood a child with its back turned. My throat went dry. I lowered the camera and looked directly at it. The doll still sat motionless. I told myself the photo was faulty, that the reflection came from somewhere else. But my hands had gone icy cold. Then I made the first mistake. The mistake that began everything. I stared into its eyes longer than an ordinary glance, only to try to make out what exactly was inside that layer of glass. At first, it felt like I was looking into a very deep surface. Then the rings of light around me began to fade. The sound of the wind, the chickens, the bamboo knocking together outside the gate all disappeared. Only those eyes remained, growing larger, closer, filling my whole field of vision. I do not know how many minutes I stood there frozen. Only that a sudden sharp pain stabbed through the back of my head and I jerked awake. Stumbling backward, my whole body was drenched in sweat even though the wind was cold. The most horrifying thing was that in that brief moment just before, I had felt that it was not I who was looking at the doll, but that whatever was inside those eyes was looking at me, very closely, like something that had found what it had been searching for. I grabbed a cloth and covered it, my hands shaking so badly that I had to try twice before I managed. That night I locked the doors more tightly, dragged the bed against the room entrance, and left the light on all night. But the light did nothing. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone singing on the porch. The voice was very soft, tuneless, just a warped humming like someone unfamiliar with using a living throat to make sound. I sat up. The singing stopped. Immediately afterward, from the last room in the corridor came the sound of objects knocking together and then a slow dragging sound. I took my flashlight, and I do not know what surge of panic made me open the door. The corridor was pitch dark. The beam swept over wooden columns, over an old calendar peeling at the corners, over a damp stain on the wall shaped like a handprint. Then it stopped in the middle of the floor. The cloth I had used to cover the doll lay there, as if someone had yanked it off and thrown it aside, and the doll was standing a meter away from it, not sitting, not leaning, standing. I knew perfectly well that afternoon I had placed it sitting on the stool outside, covered it completely with the cloth. Now it was standing in the corridor. its legs straight, its dress touching the floor, its head tilted slightly to the right as though curious. The flashlight beam shook wildly over its face. Its mouth was a little wider than before. From where I stood, I could see that inside it was not empty blackness, but something wet and shiny clinging to the inner porcelain. I took a step back. The doll did not move, but I heard breathing, not my own breathing. It was very faint, uneven, like the lungs of a child filling with water. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it until morning. The next day I decided to leave the house, at least for a few days. I packed my things and called for a car from the town below. But the rain that began at noon came down too heavily, and the dirt road was washed out. The driver called to say he could not get in. My phone signal came and went. I was stranded in Dong Mu on the very night the power went out across the whole hamlet. Darkness fell earlier than usual, thick and heavy as wet cloth. Old Bay came over with an oil lamp. Seeing that I was determined not to stay alone, he sat with me for a while. In the flickering flame, his face was deeply lined like an old mask. He told me something more that he had not dared say the day before. Those who had stared too long into the doll's eyes, if they did not die immediately, would begin dreaming of a room with no windows. In that room came the sound of a child crying behind the wall. Each night they would see themselves standing closer to that wall. On the final night, they would see a hole open in the wall, and from inside a small hand would reach out and pull them in. The next morning, their loved ones would only find the body sitting rigid like an abandoned object. The eyes darkening, the skin cold, the mouth slightly open as though trying to call to someone from the bottom of the throat. Hearing this, I suddenly remembered something. Aunt Han had died in the city, but the person who had watched over her body said that before she breathed her last, she had stared fixedly into the corner of the hospital room and muttered, "Don't open its eyes." When I asked Old Bay about it, he only lowered his head in silence. That rainy night was the first night I dreamed of the room. In the dream I stood barefoot on a damp, cold concrete floor. All around me was pitch black, except for the smell of mold and the sound of water dripping somewhere. In front of me stood an old plaster wall, and at eye level there was a long curved crack. From the other side of the wall came the muffled sobbing of a child. Very close, yet unclear. I wanted to step back, but my feet could not move. The crack on the wall trembled as though something were scratching from the other side. Bits of plaster fell away. Then an eye opened inside the crack, black and glossy, staring straight at me. I jolted awake, my mouth full of a fishy taste like dirty water. The oil lamp had gone out. Rain was still falling outside. In the darkness, right beneath the bed, came a faint childish giggle. I did not move. The giggle stopped. A moment later, something began crawling out from under the bed. I could not see it. I only heard elbows and knees scraping across the floor with a dry rustling sound. It crawled very slowly, as though deliberately drawing out the terror of the one waiting above. When that damp, cold breathing reached the edge of the bed, I screamed, fumbled for the lighter, and lit the lamp. Light flared up. There was nothing at my feet, but on the edge of the bed, only a handspan from my knee, were 5 tiny wet marks, like the handprint of a child. The next morning I could not bear it anymore. I decided to open the last room in the corridor. partly because I wanted an explanation, partly because some instinct told me that every clue lay inside it. The rusted chain came off more easily than I expected, as though it had been waiting to be removed. The moment the door opened, a gust of cold air and the sharp smell of old extinguished incense hit my face. The room was very small, with a low ceiling and no window. The walls were covered with faded talismans, many torn or singed at the edges. In the middle of the room stood an old wooden cradle. Inside it there was nothing except a rotting blanket. In one corner stood a low altar. Upon it a bowl of incense filled with burnt-down sticks and several neatly folded sets of children's clothes already green with mold. On the wall above the altar hung a black and white photograph. In it was Aunt Han as a young woman, standing beside a little girl of about 6 holding the doll. The girl's face was unclear because someone had scratched it to pieces with a sharp object. But the doll remained intact. And strangely, although the photograph was old, its eyes were still black and glossy in an unnatural way, like 2 drops of fresh ink. I reached out to take the frame down when behind me came the soft sound of a door closing. I spun around. The room door was still open, but a shadow had just slipped past the corridor outside. Small, short, with long hair. For an instant, instead of fear, I felt rage. The exhaustion, lack of sleep, and the terror built up over several days made my head burn. I rushed into the corridor, chasing the shadow all the way to the backyard. The sky was overcast, the banana garden dark from the rain the night before. The shadow vanished behind the well. I ran to it and found no one there. Only the murky surface of the well water rippling, though there was no wind. I bent down to look. The water reflected my warped face and the gray sky above. Then from deep below, something white began to rise. Slowly, 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 like a face that had been submerged too long in water. The black eyes appeared first. Then the hair, the cracked forehead, and the slightly open mouth. I fell backward. The water in the well burst outward in large ripples, as though something had just slapped it hard from below. From that day onward, I no longer doubted. It had marked me. What happened afterward came faster than I thought. I began seeing it in every reflective surface. In the glass cabinet. In the corner of the bathroom mirror. In my phone screen before it lit up. At first it stood far away, usually several meters behind me. Then each day it came closer. One night I was brushing my teeth when I looked into the mirror and saw it standing right behind my shoulder. Its head tilted so close that it nearly touched my cheek. I turned around. There was nothing, but when I turned back to the mirror, in the reflection, it was still there. I did not dare sleep. Every time I drifted off, I returned to the dark room with the cracked wall. The crying behind the wall became clearer and clearer. By the 3rd night, I realized it was no longer crying, but calling my name in the drowned voice of a child. "Brother Nam, open it, it's so dark." Each time I heard that sentence, I woke with both hands covered in plaster dust, as though in my sleep I had been clawing at a real wall. One rainy afternoon, Old Bay noticed I had not come over for hot water as I did every day. So he came to the house. He walked into the room just as I was taking a hammer to smash the doll. I had found it sitting in the cradle in the last room of the corridor at some point without knowing when. Now dressed in a brand new child's shirt that I was certain I had never seen before. The moment Old Bay saw it, he went pale and threw himself forward to stop my hand. The hammer dropped to the floor with a hard crack. The doll did not move. But I swear that at the very instant the hammer had almost touched its face. Its eyes blinked, very slowly, as though eyelids of porcelain had been pulled down and lifted from within. Old Bay dragged me into the yard, his voice shaken. He said it could not be destroyed by ordinary force. To end it, we had to find out its source. Whatever had attached itself to it in the beginning. He said that long ago there was a rumor that the doll was not an ordinary toy. It had been made to contain the soul of a child who died unjustly in a fire in the region beyond the mountain. But the ritual had been done wrong, or deliberately twisted. Instead of holding one spirit, it became an empty cage, something hungry for the gaze, memories, and life of anyone who looked at it too long. Each victim was not taken at once, but was slowly hollowed out, layer by layer, through dreams, through reflections, through fear fed larger each night. By the time the person was empty inside, only the body remained, the rest was pulled in, somewhere behind those black eyes. I asked Old Bay how it could be stopped. He fell silent. Then he answered very softly, "Only by exchange." I did not understand at first. But then he continued, his aged voice suddenly firm. "One person must willingly go in to bring the others out. But all these years, has anyone ever come back?" I got angry and told him he was speaking superstitious nonsense. But deep down, I knew he was not lying. Because that night, when the power was out, I heard from the last room in the corridor not just the crying of one child, but many voices layered together. Tiny and choking, they called, scratched, begged, as though behind that wall there was a place packed tight with mouths that could no longer see the light. Among those voices rose one I recognized immediately, though I had never heard it in life, Aunt Han's voice. She whispered, exhausted, as if drained after many years. "Don't look at it, Nom, don't let it know your face." Too late. I froze when I heard a faint clacking sound behind me. Turning around, I saw the doll standing in the doorway of my room. It was no longer as small as before. Or rather, the sense of its size had changed. It stood almost to the waist of an adult, with shoulder-length hair and an old dress soaked as if it had just climbed out of the well. Water dripped steadily from the hem onto the floor. Its porcelain face was deathly white, covered in fine cracks like a spiderweb. Its mouth was open, wider than any toy's mouth should be able to open. Inside was not darkness but something writhing, black and deep, like the throat of a small cave that was breathing. I backed away until my spine hit the wall. It took one more step. Its footsteps did not sound like wood or cloth, but like soft flesh stepping on a wet floor. I closed my eyes, remembering Old Bay's warning, refusing to look into its face. But even with my eyes shut, I could still see those eyes directly in front of me, as though printed on the inside of my eyelids. A freezing pain drove into the middle of my forehead. In my head sounded the laughter of a child. Then a dry whisper, "Seen." When I opened my eyes, the room was gone. I was standing once more in the dark room from my dream. But this time I was not in front of the wall. I was on the other side of it. Behind me crowded countless cowering figures pressed together. With no clear faces, they breathed softly, trembling, like shadows stored away too long. Before me, Two huge black holes were opening in the darkness, the doll's eyes. Through them I could dimly see my real room, see my own body standing rigid, eyes open but unfocused, and facing that body stood the doll, now resembling a little girl in an old dress. Her head tilted so far to one side it nearly touched her shoulder, smiling at me with a mouth split wide. I do not know how long I remained in that darkness. In that place there was no time, only crying that came and went, scratching against walls, the moldy smell of sealed space, and the feeling that some part of myself was being drawn out bit by bit. I thought of Old Bay's words, "Only by exchange." That meant either I would let myself rot away like all those before me, or I had to find a way to drag that thing out of its cage. In the darkness, I touched the people standing around me. Many cold hands clutched at my wrists as though pleading for help. One of them was thin and strangely familiar. When I gripped it, Aunt Han's whisper came through the dark. "It really fears fire, but only if its eyes are opened." I did not understand that until the moment I saw, beyond those black eyes, Old Bay appear in the doorway. I do not know how he had managed to enter my room. In his hand was a torch soaked in oil and a long sewing needle. I wanted to shout to stop him, but in that dark place my throat could not make a sound. Old Bay walked very slowly, avoiding looking into the doll's face, murmuring something that sounded like an ancient invocation. The doll turned its head toward him. Its head turned too far, twisting more than halfway around while the body did not move. Old Bay kept coming, his hand shaking violently but never stopping. When he was only a handspan away, he raised the needle and drove it straight into one eye. The scream that erupted was unlike any sound I had ever heard. It did not only strike the ears, it ran through teeth, bones, and the ground. The dark room where I was trapped shook violently. All the shadowed people around me lifted their heads at once. A thin crack of light split open in one of the black holes before me. Outside, the doll thrashed wildly, its dress flying up to reveal legs not made of cloth, but white bones clinging to bruised flesh. Old Bay shouted something I could not hear, but his lips clearly formed the words, "Get out." At that very moment, the torch in his hand swept across the doll's face. The flame caught in its hair and flared up. The stench of burning hair filled the place. In the darkness, I heard dozens of screams bursting out at once. The crack in one eye widened. I lunged forward on instinct, grabbed one hand beside me, and ran toward the slit of light. But the slit convulsed violently, as though about to close. Behind me, something seized my ankle with tremendous force. I looked down and saw a tiny hand, skin deathly white, with long black nails like those of a drowned corpse. It was dragging me backward. In the darkness behind, the little girl from the photograph appeared. Her face no longer scratched out. It was in, or what had once been in. Her face was swollen with water, her lips purple, her eyes solid black without whites. She smiled, her mouth opened all the way to her ears. I grabbed another arm in the darkness and poured every bit of strength I had into pulling both that body and myself toward the crack of light. I did not know whom I was pulling. I only knew that if I let go, everything would sink back again. The pain in my leg shot up into my skull, as if teeth had sunk into the bone. Then suddenly the force on my ankle vanished. Someone outside had struck again. The crack tore wider, Fire poured in. I fell headlong out onto the real floor, vomiting violently, my mouth full of the taste of smoke and fishy well water. The room before me blurred and then slowly sharpened. The doll was burning in the middle of the room, writhing like a living thing. Old Bay lay against the wall, his chest drenched in blood. A long shard of porcelain was embedded deep in his throat. Beside him, on the floor, another person lay curled up, coughing violently, a woman so thin she was almost skeletal, her hair more than half white, her eyes sunken deep. It took me several seconds to recognize that it was Aunt Han. She was not dead, or not entirely dead, at least until that moment. She looked at me, her lips trembling, tears spilling from eye sockets that had nearly lost all expression. She said very softly that she had tried to keep it in that house all these years, feeding it with her own self so it would not wander beyond the hamlet. Each time it demanded more, she would return, lock herself in before it, let it look at her, so that other people could live in peace. But age and illness had weakened her. Before dying in the hospital, she thought she would be pulled all the way inside. But Old Bay had somehow kept a part of her back, only not for much longer. She took my hand, cold as a piece of wet cloth, and whispered, "Don't let anyone keep it anymore, end it." The flames on the doll suddenly went out as though sucked inward. The room sank into an unnatural darkness even though the firelight was still there. From the middle of the smoke, that thing stood up. It was no longer the doll, but a disgusting fusion of toy, child, and corpse. Its porcelain head had split open to reveal patches of grayish flesh beneath. One eye was now only a black socket with the long needle lodged in it. The other eye was stretched wide beyond reason, the pupil swallowing all the white. Its body bulged as though stuffed with tiny hands writhing under the dress. With every step it took, clumps of wet hair and children's teeth fell from beneath its hem and clicked across the floor. It looked straight at me. This time I did not look away. Maybe it was madness, maybe despair, but I understood that if I kept avoiding its gaze, I would remain nothing but prey cornered by it. I grabbed the oil lamp and smashed it hard against the floor. The fuel ignited, flames bursting outward across the wooden planks. At the same time, I lunged forward and drove a burning splinter of wood straight into its remaining eye. The thing shrieked, the scream sounding like hundreds of children crying at once inside the lungs of a dying person. Its face came right up against mine. The stench of rotting mud, well water, and decayed flesh blew straight into my mouth. Inside its gaping throat I saw not a tongue but countless human faces crushed tightly together. Eyes open, lips moving soundlessly. The fire spread very quickly because the old house was all dry wood. The thatched roof, the curtains, the old talismans, the children's clothes on the altar all caught fire. Aunt Han screamed for me to run, but I could not lift my legs. Tiny hands reached out from beneath the creature's dress and wrapped tightly around my ankles. They were cold and slick, squeezing so hard I heard my bones creak. I thought I was going to die there. Then Old Bay, with the last of his strength, crawled forward with an iron bar and smashed it hard into the thing's head. The blow did not knock it down, but it was enough to make it turn. In that instant, the hands released my legs. I pulled Aunt Han to her feet and ran into the corridor through the smoke and fire and the roar that shook the whole roof. We had only just made it to the yard when the side wing collapsed with a terrible crashing sound. Flames shot upward, staining the rainy night with a sick red glow. In the firelight, through the half-burned doorway, I could still see its silhouette standing motionless amid the wreckage, its body blackened by fire yet still upright. Then the rest of the roof collapsed and buried everything. The people of the hamlet came when the rain had just begun to ease. They managed to stop the fire before it spread to the garden. But the side wing and the last room in the corridor were reduced to wet black rubble. Old Bay died before dawn. Aunt Han also passed away on the stretcher, her eyes open but seeing nothing. Before breathing her last, she said only one sentence: "If it can still see, it can still return." The next morning, while the ashes were still smoking, I and several villagers searched through the ruins for keepsakes and remains. We found the charred picture frame, the broken incense bowl, several metal buttons, but we did not find a single shard of porcelain belonging to the doll. No head, no hands, no eyes, only on the wet earth, exactly where the last room of the corridor had once stood. There was a ring of tiny footprints turning in a circle, as though a child had stood there looking up at the sky while the house collapsed around it. I left Dongmu 3 days later, bringing Aunt Han's ashes back to the city and placing them in a pagoda. I told no one the whole truth. People only knew that the house had burned because an oil lamp tipped over on a rainy night. I tried to return to my old life, bury myself in work, forget the tuneless singing on the porch, the fingernails scratching the wall, and the unblinking stare of those black glass eyes. For many months, I thought I had escaped. Until one night, while editing photos in my studio, I accidentally opened the folder of pictures taken in Dongmu. There was one photo I did not remember ever taking. It was a close-up of a scorched glass eye lying in ashes. In its glossy black surface, reflected very clearly, was my current workspace, the desk, the light stands, the window, the back of my chair, and directly behind me, so close it nearly touched my hair, stood a little girl in an old dress. I turned around. No one was there. But in the wall mirror opposite me, I saw clearly a small white hand slowly coming to rest on my shoulder. From that night on, every morning when I woke up, I found another object on my work desk that did not belong in my house. A rusted child's button, a damp moldy ribbon, a tiny baby tooth, and this morning, when I opened my bedroom door, I saw a doll sitting on the chair opposite the dressing table. It is not exactly the same as the old one, but I recognized those eyes immediately. Black eyes that do not reflect me, but reflect a dark room with a cracked wall. Behind that wall comes the soft scratching sound. Then the whisper of a child, "Brother Nam, look at me." If you are reading this now, you may think I invented this story because I went mad, because of trauma, because of the haunting left in me after the fire. Perhaps sometimes I myself want to believe that, but there is one thing I need to do before my mind rots away completely. I have to leave this warning behind, whole and unchanged, for anyone unlucky enough to see that thing after me. If you ever come across a strange doll in your house, outside your door, in a photograph, in a mirror, or anywhere it should not possibly appear, do not touch it, do not pick it up, do not tell yourself that it is only an old toy someone forgot. And even if you hear crying, singing, Your own name being called. Even if you see it change places. Blink. Or smile. Do not do the most foolish thing of all. Never stare too long into its eyes. Because the moment you look too long, it will recognize your face. It will know your voice, your heartbeat, your greatest fear. It will follow you through sleep, through mirrors, through water, through photographs, through the darkness beneath the bed and the silences after midnight. It will not rush to take you at once. It is more patient than anything alive out there. It will gnaw at you bit by bit, until one day you are no longer sure that the one breathing inside your body is still you. And when the final night comes, you will see a dark room with no windows. You will hear scratching behind the wall. You will see an eye open in the crack. At that point, even if your body in the real world is still sitting in a chair, still has its eyes open, still appears alive, the rest of you is already standing behind its eyes, pressed among those who never found their way back. If by then you can still remember any sentence of mine, remember this one. Never stare too long at this doll. Because it is possible that the moment you finish reading this last line, it is already sitting somewhere very close, motionless, obedient, waiting for the exact instant when you look up and meet its eyes.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.